Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Cătălin Tudor. I'm a software architect at Keysight Technologies Romania, and I'll be your host for the next hour on the 5th edition of Keysight Connect. And before getting to the actual presentation, let me share a couple of words about Keysight Technologies Romania, who we are, what we do, and what makes it so cool to be part of this company. We are a leading technology company that helps enterprises, service providers, and governments to accelerate innovation, to connect and secure the world. Our story in Romania dates back to 1994 as one of the first software companies with US investment in Bucharest, which in 2004 became Ixia Romania. 14 years later, in 2018, we were acquired by Keysight Technologies, a company with roots in Agilent HP original testing business, and this propelled us towards an even more global perspective. Our mission is to achieve breakthroughs, to improve everybody's life, to secure worldwide communication, and to connect people across the globe. We were among the first to establish a research laboratory at the Polytechnic University of Bucharest, to organize internship programs, to organize internal hackathons, and to support the local startup ecosystem. From the business perspective, we are curious and we explore the latest technologies in 5G communication, security, cloud, Kubernetes, networking, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, and that's just to name a few. But you see, exploring isn't enough to generate innovation. That's why we also focus our efforts in building real-world products for some of the most demanding customers and business ecosystems, like aerospace and defense, automotive and energy, semiconductors, quantum computing, and Internet of Things mainly. That's about business success, but this is only the half of the deal. The other half is about people. And one of the best advices that I received so far is that you can accomplish anything when you have purpose and balance. So we make it our goal for our colleagues to find meaning in their work. We offer everyone opportunities to develop and be hands-on on various and latest technologies as part of teams that value a diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace. All of this comes at Keysight Technologies Romania with a flexible work from home schedule, a great location downtown, easily accessible from anywhere, and a great mix of benefits package. If this made you at least curious, and if you want to work for what is probably the best company in the world, let's meet and discuss how we could leverage together the passion on our projects. You can contact us at https://jobs.keysight.com, and that's on the Keysight website. And because I've mentioned passion, projects, and security, let me introduce Simona David and Radu Kishkariu, who will share with us some of their insights on what is called supply chain attacks and its impact on companies. Don't forget, if you have questions, please ask them at the end of the presentation, either via voice or add them to the chat window. Thank you. Simona, Radu, you have the mic.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well and you can see my screen. Together with Radu, we will host this presentation where we will talk about supply chain attacks. A bit about the summary. We will talk about what are supply chain attacks and we will present some examples. We will talk, of course, about SolarWinds as it was the largest supply chain attack of 2020. We will talk about dependency confusion and how we can prevent this type of attacks and what coverage we offer through our products. A traditional supply chain looks like this. We have a need, we have a factory that transforms the idea into a product. We have a shipping solution, we have a marketplace, and the end users. In terms of software, the supply chain is very similar. We have an idea or a need that is transposed into lines of code. The code is built and the final product is delivered to multiple customers. Now I will let Radu go through some examples of supply chain attacks.
Hello, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. I will go through a couple of supply chain attacks that were documented in 2020. One of them was entitled Operation Keysight. It was an attack that targeted the Vietnam Government Certification Authority, in short, VGCA. This government entity has the authority of issuing digital certificates used to sign different kind of official documents. In addition to issuing certificates, they also develop and distribute a digital signature toolkit that is used by citizens, companies, and government entities from Vietnam to automatically sign documents with a valid VGCA digital certificate. So this represents a very juicy target for adversaries. If they can somehow gain access to the network and steal these valid certificates, they can afterwards sign their malicious binaries with them and then gain a level of trust that would basically allow them to easily infect other government entities, because they would look as if there would be valid binaries or valid documents. In this case, for this attack, what happened was that the attackers have managed to exploit a vulnerability that they found in the VGCA website. And after they compromised the web server, they have inserted malware into the installer applications that we talked about earlier, the ones that can be used to automatically sign documents. And after that, they have simply replaced the original versions of the installers. And now, as we said earlier, the last thing that the attackers needed to do is to sign the forged installers with the legitimate certificates that they possessed. So that would let them spread this Trojanite version of the applications further. But they didn't do that. They didn't sign their forged binaries. And why they didn't? Because even the original, the benign installers, weren't correctly signed. The one job that VGCA had to do, they haven't managed to do that as well. As for the actual inserted malware, this wasn't really complex. An asset report states that the malware consisted of a dropper that, once executed, extracts a Windows cabinet file. And that cabinet file contained the actual backdoor that was an DLL, which is registered as a service in order to attain persistence. When VGCA was notified by asset, they confirmed that they were already aware of this attack, and they started to inform the users who downloaded the Trojanized software. But even so, asset telemetry shows that the Trojanized installers were available from July to August 2020, which means that the adversaries had access for about 1 month to the VGCA web server and implicitly to their valid certificates. This is one attack that one supply chain attack that happened in 2020. Now let's discuss about the Operation Stealthy Trident. What happened this time? This time the attackers targeted an application called Able Desktop, which is developed by a company from Mongolia named Able Software. This application is actually, it is an extension that provides instant messaging capabilities to the company's principal product, main product, which is a business management suite. Why have the adversaries chosen this target? One reason might be that the platform has a lot of customers from the government environment. The Able Software company published on their website that more than 400 Mongolian government agencies use their product. So basically, they were inviting adversaries to attack them. As for how the actual attack was conducted, their MO was a little different from what we have previously seen with Keysight. The attack against Able software against this company had multiple stages, and attempts to Trojanize Able applications were documented since 2017. That time, the adversaries started with a spear phishing attacks against Able employees. So they were hoping that if an employee would click on a phishing email, they would start a sequence that would basically allow the attackers to get into their network. And after that, they were start pivoting into further systems to achieve further and a more refined persistence. Some research shows that Microsoft Word vulnerability was actually used in this initial stage of the attack. So what this means is that if a user from that company was having a vulnerable version of Microsoft Word, when the employee would open the attached document in the email, then the vulnerable version of the Microsoft Word would simply allow for remote code execution, and the attacker would gain access to the machine of the customer. The available data suggests that this first attempt was actually successful. So a user from Able software was tricked, and this is how the adversaries gained access into their network. And after that, they successfully pivoted to an update server. And with the update server compromised, the adversaries inserted malware into the updates for the Able software. And from that point onwards, it was just a waiting game until they finally managed to spread into the networks of the government and agencies of interest, because the update server was providing updates for all of those government agencies that we discussed initially, and they were pulling updates from that server that was already compromised. The research revolving this attack couldn't exactly attribute it to a specific APT group, but from different researches that I've looked into, everyone pretty much point fingers to Chinese APTs, such as Black Mouse. And as mentioned earlier, it took the attackers about 3 years to reach their goals, to get into the network of that government entities. And this observation for me sheds some perspective into how patiently this group operates. Before delving into SolarWinds, I will say a couple of words about one last campaign, namely the Lazarus Campaign. For starters, it is useful to know that in South Korea, the internet users are frequently required to install additional security software when visiting government and banking websites. So each government and banking entity that have some website as well, they're building their own software, or they are present with certain recommendations. These security requirements are installed by each user directly from the browser when they are going to that specific website. So as I said, there is something that works like a browser extension, an application which is called Visvera Veraport. And this application is developed in South Korea, and it manages the automatic installation of the said security software requirements. And this application requires little to no user interaction, and it manages the requirements for most of the banking and the government websites in South Korea. So it's a very employed application. What happened this time is that the adversaries managed to compromise 2 of these websites and inserted the Lazarus malware into the said dependencies for the compromised website. And then they abused the Veraport feature to further spread the Lazarus malware. The attackers could not tamper with the Veraport application and its configuration files because they were digitally signed, and the attackers could not gain access to the Veraport servers. But what what they did instead, they tampered with the requirements of a compromised website. And they use Veraport as a dropper, basically. And you might think now that for a specific website, the Veraport application should verify that the digital signature corresponding to a website requirement is valid before you make that install. So you want to make sure that for each user, you will verify that the code that you are going to install in that machine as a requirement is the exact code that you want to install. It is digitally signed. And the Veracode application does this, but it doesn't do it correctly. The problem is that it doesn't verify whether the signature belongs to the right website, namely the website that the user is trying to interact with, which means that the adversary can trojanize the requirements for any website and successfully bypass the signature verification check using only those two certificates that they managed to obtain from successfully compromised two websites. And there's one more thing. There is also an option in the Veracode application that allows a website to disable the signature checking altogether. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of websites, even government entities, that were doing that for convenience and ease of configuration. So you could simply use this option to disable the code checking, the code validity, and it would be easier to deploy a set of requirements for the website that you have. And this was also something that the attacker were lucky to be available, and they could further spread the malware. So that's it with Operation Lazarus. Now I will leave Simona to discuss about the SolarWinds attack.
Thank you. The most important supply chain attack of 2020 was, of course, the SolarWinds one. But why? SolarWinds offer network performance monitoring tools to around 30,000 customers from all domains like telecom, healthcare, and governments. And out of the 30,000 customers, 18,000 are potential victims of this attack. It all started on December 8th when FireEye published a blog post acknowledging that their red team tools were stolen. But what does red team tool mean? Red teams simulate attacks against an organization to test the effectiveness of the network security. So a red team acts like an attacker would. So those tools that were stolen were just some scripts used to simulate how an attacker would exploit certain known vulnerabilities. Thankfully, there are no zero days exploits involved. So that happened on December 8th. On December 11th, FireEye discovered that they are just a collateral victim. They have been hacked through a malicious SolarWinds update. The investigation naturally continued on SolarWinds site, and they discovered that the attackers may have accessed their platforms in September 2019 when a code injection test was performed. So the attackers took their time. They didn't insert directly the malware into the build process. They started with the test code injection. And 2 months later, the testing period stops and the test code is removed. In February 2020, the malware is injected into the build process. The code is built and signed by SolarWinds, and the updates are published for the clients to download and install. With the malware being already delivered, the attackers remove it from the build virtual machines. The updates were published in March, but the FireEye incident is discovered 9 months later in December 2020. A few interesting details related to the timeline. The attackers tested the ability of injecting code before delivering the actual malware. During that timeline, there were 2 incidents reported by customers. At that moment, they remained unsolved, and the malware, though they investigated, was still not discovered. The vulnerabilities were investigated and remediated, but the malware was still not discovered. How is this supply chain attack possible? Well, the plugin with the malicious content is part of SolarWinds product, and SolarWinds is trusted by their customers. So naturally, when the update was available, the customers downloaded and installed the update. Because, well, even me as a security person, I always tell people to install the latest updates or latest packages for whatever applications they use. The malware remains inactive for up to 2 weeks, and after that, its traffic blends in with legitimate SolarWinds activity. And it seems like the perfect piece of malware, and they almost got away with it. But how is this detected? The attackers try to keep a low footprint, and they used the legitimate credentials. But they got greedy and tried to enroll a device to the FireEye VPN. And I can't even imagine what would have happened if this went unnoticed. After this, FireEye made the responsible thing. They did a public disclosure of their findings. Thankfully, no 0 days exploits were involved. But it's hard to imagine that the attackers put so much effort into creating the perfect malware just to steal some scripts for publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. So you have to think that maybe this was just a low-hanging fruit, or they just got whatever they found on the way out, let's say. But in fact, we don't know. Another victim was Microsoft. The attackers accessed some internal source code. Microsoft did not offer that many details, but they say that anyway they treat their code as publicly disclosed, so they don't have an issue with this. During our research, we found that many companies put different names to the same piece of malware. So the first one is Sunspot, which is the implant. It was named the stellar particle in some research done by CrowdStrike. Sunburst is the backdoor. Teardrop is a post-exploitation tool. And Supernova is not a malicious code embedded within the SolarWinds build. It's just placed on servers after they have been hacked, and it is designed to look like being part of SolarWinds products as well. This campaign has a combination of never-before-seen techniques. Teardrop is a memory-only dropper that runs as a service, spawns a thread, and makes use of steganography. For me, this was a first because I've never seen the use of steganography in real-life attack. I've only seen it in some CTF challenges. The attackers set the hostname of the command and control infrastructure to match a legitimate hostname from the internal network. This way, the traffic does not seem suspicious. They also use IPs from the victims' countries, making use of virtual private servers. And they gained access with compromised credentials, and this allowed them to move inside the network. They also used file replacements to execute their payloads, and after the execution, they restored the original file. The takeaways. Of course, we will hear more about this because it is an ongoing investigation. We do not know the full extent of the attack. We don't know what companies or public institutions were targeted. We do not know who did it. There are some rumors that this is a nation-state-sponsored attacks by the Russians, but there is no resemblance between, for example, Teardrop and any other malware. But there are some resemblances between other pieces from this campaign, pieces of malware from this campaign, and some malware created by APT29 or the Cozy Bears. In fact, at this moment, we cannot say who did it. We cannot say what kind of information they exfiltrated. But we know that they gained access to compromised credentials. So we will talk a bit about the password security. We are always taught that passwords that respect a certain pattern are better, but in fact, the complexity of the password is less important than its length. For example, with the first password, we have 9 characters with a total of 94 options for each character. Because we have 26 uppercase, 26 lowercase, 10 digits, and 32 special characters. So the attacker has 5.7 times 10 to the power 17 options to guess our password. But you have to remember that people use patterns. For example, we can say that the majority of people will start the password with a capital letter, or the majority of people will end their password with a special character. So we can reduce the number of options that we have to guess that password. When we use longer passwords, even though you have a lower number of options, we have only 26 options in our case because we used only lowercase letters. It leads to a bigger number of options. So the attacker has to go through many more passwords than the first case. So the password length is more important than the complexity, even though applications teach us to use passwords that are complex, that have to use special characters or digits. In fact, it's important to not use always the same password. So you can't remember 30 or 300 passwords. So the option would be to use a password manager, and I suggest KeyPass because I use that and I like it. And it was audited, it is open source, and you have all your passwords all in one place. So we've talked about SolarWinds and how this was a targeted and sophisticated supply chain attack. And we have to wonder if this is likely to happen to us, simple users. Well, we all use pip, I hope, because we all use Python. And let's assume we create an application that makes use of a package that we created as well, named package with a version 1 stored in our private repo. If the attacker knows that we created that package with that name, he can create a package with the same name but a higher version in a public repo. And when issuing this pip command, people will be confused because he has 2 options. He can use the version in our private repo with the package in our private repo with the version of 1, or he can use the package from the public repo with the version 10. So he will go for the public repo. Another problem may be typo squatting, because you can see that when looking at the first line, the two package names seem identical. But what about now? Because I changed the font and it seems that even though they looked the same before, now we notice a difference. The third character for the first package is lowercase l, and for the second package is an uppercase I. I have some other examples, but the jellyfish one really stuck with me. And I will let Radu present a bit about the prevention.
So as you can see, the attackers can get really creative. They can even think about creating a dependency that someone might use that look very similar and to a package that is actually used, hoping that someone will mistype when it will install that dependency, and it will actually install code that it will allow an attacker to obtain access. And this really goes to show that the prevention of supply chain attacks is not that really straightforward thing. As you might have seen, they really differ quite a lot among themselves. You have you have issues with tempered code when the attacker managed to gain access and compromise one of your update server. You can have issues with incorrect signing, but there are a couple of things that you can start with in order to prevent such attacks. In my opinion, the rule of thumb is to treat each third-party code as a separate attack surface entirely. You should take into consideration that there is this possibility that the third-party code that you're using might have been tampered with. So essentially, if there is one thing that you want to remember from this presentation, is the supply chain attacks breaks the trust between two entities that are sharing code. The one that is using a code that is provided will simply accept, will simply go start with the premise that that code is valid, has not been tampered in, and is the real deal, and the attacker can break that trust, and it can get his way into infecting the client, the one that is using a code, an external code. As you've seen with the Veraport and the security requirements example, incorrect code signing is also something that the adversaries can exploit. If your third-party code takes the form of some executables, let's say, you must make sure that those binaries are signed with a valid certificate. And you must also check that the owner of the certificate used to sign the binaries has the same identity to the owner of the third-party code. Lastly, as you saw, dependency confusion and typo squatting are very creative ideas, but they can be avoided essentially if you make sure that the private dependencies are installed only and only from our private registries. The exact versions of the requirements should be specified when the dependencies are solved. So this, for me, would be some starting points in order to avoid this kind of attacks. We went into this attacks and this example, and we tried to understand how the attacker operate, and we went a little bit further, and we tried to implement some of these attacks into our security products. One thing to be mentioned is that, as you can imagine, supply chain attacks are quite difficult to simulate because we're talking network behavior that needs to be simulated. We're talking about endpoint behavior that needs to be simulated, and you have this operation that they need to be specifically defined one after the other in a correct manner as to mimic, as to simulate the attack, and it's really not that. There's you must put some thought into it, but even so, we come up with some assessment and some simulation for to our products, namely for threat simulator and breaking point. If breaking point is more concerned with testing the validity of signature for, let's say, a TWARM test, in order to test the validity of the signature for an IPS, let's say. Threat simulator goes a little bit further and allows you to create very complex assessments in which you can define the whole kill chain attack that an attacker would use, and you can basically compose an attack as a puzzle, and you can define an attack that would be best suited for the kind of environment, the kind of the networking environment that you have for your organization. And we tried to come up with assessment for for Sunburst and I guess we still want to go further and provide more assessments and more examples of simulation for more supply chain attacks.
Yeah, we want to include also the other steps of the campaigns because we saw that Sunburst is just the backdoor, but we also have Teardrop, which is the dropper. We have Supernova, which is after the post-exploitation part. And we want to include that also, but we also have the Sunburst IOCs, so we included that as well. Here are some more resources, and if you have questions.
Thank you, Simona. Thank you, Radu. As you said, we can now take questions. You can either say with voice or you can write in the chat window.
Or feedback.
Or feedback, yes. If there are no questions, it means that we were very clear.
I have a question, Radu. Is there a way or is there an information about what was the impact, I mean the financial impact of these attacks, or at least in, I'm not referring necessarily to Sunburst, but maybe some others you've described. Do you have such numbers or estimations?
Usually, if we're talking about government entities, they are very reluctant in giving any pieces of information regarding the impact of the attack. And going to the penalty, the financial penalty, I guess that would be even more hidden from the prying eyes, let's say. But as this is an ongoing investigation and we still not have a clear image of what happened and each steps, the image, I can imagine it was more than significant. And we saw that even Microsoft was deluded into getting infected, and they trusted code that shouldn't have been trusted. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that the impact was extremely big, and this is one of the reasons that the attack made so much noise in the media.
And also, we found out about SolarWinds, but maybe there are some other vendors that were part of this supply chain attack campaign, and the attack was not discovered because we saw that with Sunburst, it was discovered 9 months later.
We provided in the resources page, we provided a link in which there was this research made by a Romanian security researcher. He actually managed to compromise, to infect a large number of Fortune 500 companies by using the dependency confusion hack. And so if these companies, which are supposed to have a very tight security operation, have been infected, then the impact can be extremely big.
Okay, thank you.
Also, for SolarWinds, I find unfortunate that their product is now malware, and the name is like associated with the malware.
Yes, this is one of the main concerns, because the software loses any of its legitimacy if such an attack happens, because it's really hard to estimate what was the entire attack. I mean, what was its full extent, and you really have to go and try to clean the whole thing up, and you cannot help but for the customers to be really worried, and it's really hard to rebuild the trust once you lost it.
How often do such attacks get discovered before the final steps? Because I've seen in your presentation that there are many steps until the damage is done. How often do we discover such attacks in the incipient phases?
These are the kind of attacks that can really stay dormant. And as you could saw, there was this example for Stealthy Trident. It was like 3 years. A company they were affected by 3 years. They were infected for 3 years without even them noticing. So there's not a clear receipt for this attack. There are not clear steps, but what the attacker is essentially trying to do, as I said, is he's trying to break trust. And we must make sure, as software developers and software providers, that we provide the customers the means of testing and validating the code that we're providing them, and they must do that check. Like one of the NSA mottos, trust but verify. This is the thing that should be done in order to at least try to prevent supply chain attacks.
And once the attackers are inside the network, it's even harder to detect because companies usually put so much effort into defending the external part that they forget that some attacks may start from the inside.
And the attackers are really trying to cover their steps. They're trying to use very obscure protocols that are not so easy to filter, like DNS. DNS is a very good example of protocol that can be used to deliver information outside of the compromised network, because you need DNS. You need to resolve the website that you're trying to connect to. It's not that easy to filter out. And you can come with some ways of sending information to exfiltrate information from the compromised network using DNS, for example. And there are multiple examples of protocols that can be used. And attackers care a lot about the idea of staying dormant, and they can come with very creative ideas, as you saw. And they can even use steganography, as we saw. So
Thank you.